In the depths of Khazad-dûm, where the ancient hammers of the dwarves had long fallen silent, there dwelt a darkness that even the wise feared to name. Yet it was not the Balrog of Morgoth that stirred in those forgotten halls, but something far older and more terrible, a creature of flame and shadow that had slumbered since before the first rising of the sun. Erwin the Lore-keeper, last of the Noldorin scholars who had walked in the light of the two trees, descended the broken stairs of Moria with purpose that burned brighter than her silver torch. Her hair, white as starlight, flowed behind her like a banner of hope in that place of despair. For 3,000 years she had searched the libraries of Rivendell and the halls of the Grey Havens for the words that might wake the ancient powers that lay dormant beneath the earth. "The time of silence draws to its end," she whispered to the echoing darkness. Her voice, trained in the songs of Valinor, carried further than mortal speech, penetrating stone and shadow alike. The last alliance failed, and Sauron's power grows again in the east. If the free peoples are to survive what comes, we must wake those who have chosen to sleep. The passages of Moria stretched before her like the ribs of some great beast, and in their depths she felt the stirring of an intelligence vast and alien, not the mindless rage of a Balrog, but something that thought, something that remembered the music of creation itself. The flame imperishable flickered in the deepest chambers, and Erwin followed its call with the certainty of one who had heard the voice of Eru Ilúvatar in the timeless halls. As she walked, the very stones seemed to whisper of ancient days, when the dwarves delved too deep and awakened that which should have remained sleeping. But Erwin knew the truth that the histories had forgotten. They had not awakened a servant of darkness, but something far more complex, a guardian that had chosen exile over participation in the wars of the Valar. The air grew thick with heat as she descended, and soon the sound of her footsteps was joined by another rhythm, the slow, measured breathing of something immense. Fire bloomed in the darkness ahead, not the red flames of destruction, but the pure white light of stars being born. And there, in a chamber vast as the halls of Manwë, she saw her goal. The creature that coiled in the heart of the mountain was beautiful and terrible beyond description. Its form shifted between flame and flesh, between the semblance of a great worm and that of a burning tree whose roots delved deep into the foundations of the earth. Eyes like captured stars regarded her with an intelligence that had watched the shaping of the world. "So," spoke a voice, like the singing of fire itself, "after all these ages, one of the Eldar comes at last. Tell me, daughter of starlight, what brings you to seek audience with Ankalagan's forgotten brother?" Erwin stepped forward, her fear transformed into the reverence due to one of the great powers of the world. "I am Erwin Elentari, keeper of the star lore, and I come seeking the aid of Pyrex's the deep dreaming, first among the fire spirits, to choose exile over war." The great being's laughter was like the sound of a forge in which stars were hammered into shape. "Long has it been since any spoke my true name. The dwarves knew me only as the shadow in the deep, and fled when their mining disturbed my contemplation. But you, elf maiden, you know the older songs. Why do you wake me from my long meditation?" "Because the world has need of the wisdom you have gathered in your solitude," Erwin replied, spreading her arms wide. "Sauron stirs again in Mordor, and his power grows with each passing day. The free peoples are scattered and weak, and even the might of Gil-galad and Elendil could not wholly cast him down. If he is to be defeated, we must find weapons that were not in the hands of the last alliance." Pyrexes coiled his great form around the chamber, his scales reflecting the light of his inner fire, like mirrors of polished obsidian. "And what weapon would you forge from the words of one who has spent 3,000 years in contemplation? I am no mere Balrog to be sent rampaging across the fields of battle." "The greatest weapon of all," Erwin said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "understanding. You have dwelt in the deep places of the earth since the elder days. You have heard the songs that the mountains sing, felt the pulse of the world's heart. You know secrets that even the valor have forgotten. The fire spirit's eyes narrowed to brilliant points. Secrets indeed, but knowledge is a double-edged sword, Starkeeper. What I have learned in my exile could reshape the very foundations of Middle-earth, or destroy them utterly. Are you prepared for such responsibility? Erwin felt the weight of ages pressing down upon her. In all her long study of the ancient lore, she had prepared for this moment. But now that it had come, she understood how small she was in the face of such power. Yet the memory of Gil-galad's final charge at the Barad-dûr strengthened her resolve. I am prepared to bear whatever burden is necessary. The alternative is the victory of the shadow. Pyraxes was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Erwin heard the distant sound of water dripping in the depths of Moria, the settling of ancient stones, and beneath it all, the slow heartbeat of the mountain itself. Very well, the fire spirit said at last, but know this, what I will teach you cannot be unlearned. And once spoken, these words will change you forever. You will become something more than elf, yet perhaps less than what you were. Do you still choose this path? Without hesitation, Erwin knelt before the great being. I choose it. Then listen well, for I shall tell you of the song unsung, the melody that Eru held back when the music of creation was first performed. It is a song of change, of transformation, of powers that lie sleeping in the hearts of all things. But first, you must understand why I chose exile when my brethren chose war. When Melkor first corrupted my brother Ankalagan and turned him to darkness, Pyraxes began, his voice taking on the rhythm of ancient song, I saw what would come to pass. War upon war, age upon age, with the children of Eru caught between the powers of light and shadow. I could not serve Morgoth, for his was a song of pure destruction. But neither could I serve the Valar, for theirs was a song that allowed no change, no growth beyond what they had ordained. Erwin listened with growing wonder as the fire spirit spoke of the days before the awakening of the elves, when the Ainur walked freely upon Arda and shaped it according to their will. She learned of the great music's hidden harmonies, the notes that Eru had held in reserve, waiting for a time when they would be needed. The song unsung contains the power to awaken what sleeps. Pyraxes continued, not just minds and spirit, but the very stones themselves. In the deep places, I have learned to hear the dreams of mountains, the slow thoughts of the roots of the earth. All of Arda is alive, Starkeeper, but most of it sleeps so deeply that even the Valar have forgotten its true nature. And you would wake it? Erwin asked, though she already knew the answer would reshape her understanding of the world. Not wake, teach it to wake itself. For the time is coming when the free peoples will need allies they cannot imagine. The very stones will rise to fight against the shadow, and the mountains themselves will march to war. But this power comes with a price that even I, in all my long contemplation, am not certain should be paid. The fire spirit's form shifted, becoming more dragon-like, more terrible. To sing the song unsung is to give Arda itself the power of choice. No longer will it be merely the stage upon which the children of Eru play out their dramas. It will become a participant, with its own will, its own desires, its own capacity for both good and evil. Erwin felt the chamber spinning around her as the implications struck her. You speak of giving consciousness to the world itself. I speak of returning to it the consciousness it possessed in the beginning, before the music was first performed. Arda was never meant to be merely matter shaped by will. It was meant to be a partner in the great work of creation, a voice in the cosmic song that would grow and change with each passing age. The elf maiden struggled to comprehend what she was being told. In all her studies of the ancient lore, she had never encountered even a hint of such possibilities. But surely the Valar would know of this. Surely Manwë or Varda. The Valar know, Pyraxes said, his voice growing darker. Why do you think they guard the borders of Valinor so closely? Why do you think they allowed Morgoth to corrupt so much of Middle-earth before they acted? They fear what I propose, for it would make them no longer the absolute masters of this world. They would become advisors, guides, teachers, but not rulers. Understanding began to dawn in Erwin's mind, terrible and wonderful in equal measure. That is why you chose exile. You could not serve the darkness, but neither could you accept the eternal stagnation that the light offered. Just so, and now, at last, the time has come to choose. Sauron's power grows daily, and soon it will be too great for any force the free peoples can muster. But if we wake the world itself, if we teach it to fight for its own freedom, we change everything, Erwin finished. Not just the war against the shadow, but the very nature of existence in Middle-earth. Pyraxes nodded, his great head moving like a mountain settling into new foundations. Are you still willing to learn the song unsung, knowing what it will cost? Erwin thought of Gil-galad falling before the gates of Barad-dûr, of Isildur's failure at the Samath Naur, of all the brave deeds that had bought only time, never victory. Then she thought of what might be, mountains that chose to fight, rivers that turned against invaders, the very earth itself rising in defense of freedom. Teach me, she said. The learning of the song unsung was unlike any education Erwin had ever received. It was not a matter of memorizing words or understanding concepts, but of reshaping her very essence to accommodate harmonies that had never been met for the voices of the children of Eru. For 7 days and 7 nights she sat in the chamber of Pyrax, her elven mind stretched to its utmost limits as she absorbed melodies that had been present the creation of the world. On the first day, she learned the notes that spoke to stone. Her voice, trained in the high songs of Valinor, gradually found the deeper frequencies that could penetrate granite and basalt. As she sang, the walls of the chamber began to resonate, and she felt the vast consciousness of Khazad-dûm stirring to confused wakefulness. Gently, Pyraxes cautioned, his voice harmonizing with hers to keep the mountain's awakening from becoming catastrophic. You are rousing a mind that has slept for centuries. Too rapid an awakening could shatter its sanity, and ours with it. On the second day, she learned to speak with metal. The ancient dwarven axes and hammers that lay scattered throughout Moria began to sing in response to her voice, their steel cores remembering the fires of their forging. The mithril veins deep in the mountain started to pulse with their own light, no longer mere ore, but living arteries of liquid starlight. By the third day, Erwin had mastered the fundamental harmonies, but the true test came when Pyraxes led her deeper into the mountain's heart, to chambers that the dwarves had never found. There, in caverns carved not by pick and hammer, but by the slow, patient work of water over countless ages, she found the true guardians of Khazad-dûm. They were beings of living stone, Ents perhaps, or creatures similar to them, but shaped from granite and marble instead of wood and leaf. They had been sleeping since the mountain's youth, but now they stirred as Erwin's song reached them. Eyes like emeralds and sapphires opened in faces hewn from living rock, and voices like the grinding of glaciers answered her call. "Who wakes us from our long dreaming?" asked the greatest of them, a being whose body was carved from a single block of white marble veined with gold. "Who sings the songs that we heard in the world's youth? I am Erwin, and I wake you because the shadow rises again in the east. The world has need of defenders who cannot be corrupted, who cannot be turned from their purpose by fear or promise of reward." The stone shepherd, for that was what she came to call him, considered her words with the slow deliberation of his kind. "We remember the shadow. It passed over us in the elder days, but could not touch us, for we are part of the mountain's bone and the mountain's will. If it comes again, we will stand against it, as we have always stood." But even as the stone shepherds pledged their aid, Erwin felt a growing unease. The song unsung was spreading beyond her control, carried by the resonance of the mountain itself to every stone and metal vein in the misty mountains. She could feel other consciousnesses stirring, some benevolent, others utterly alien to any purpose she could understand. "This is the danger I spoke of," Pyraxes said when she voiced her concerns. Once begun, the awakening cannot be precisely controlled. We can guide it, but we cannot dictate its course. Some of what wakes will be friend, some foe, and some will be neither. Powers that pursue purposes we cannot comprehend. On the fourth day, as they climbed toward Moria's eastern gates, Erwin felt the first stirrings of something vast and terrible in the peaks above them. The Redhorn Pass, that ancient road over the misty mountains, was beginning to wake, and its dreams were filled with memories of avalanche and storm, of travelers lost in blizzards, and climbers frozen on its heights. Not all consciousness is benevolent, she realized with growing horror. Some of what we wake will be actively hostile to all life. True, Pyraxes acknowledged, but consider the alternative. Would you rather face the awakened malice of a mountain pass, or the unopposed armies of Sauron marching across Middle-earth? Word of the strange happenings in the Misty Mountains spread swiftly across Middle-earth. In Rivendell, Elrond felt the very foundations of his hidden valley trembling with new awareness, and sent his swiftest riders to discover what power had been unleashed. In Lothlorien, Galadriel gazed into her mirror and saw visions of stone giants walking and mountains bending like trees in a great wind. Even in the Shire, where the concerns of the wide world seldom penetrated, the hobbits reported that their garden stones had begun whispering to each other in voices too soft to understand. It was Master Elrond who first divined the truth, calling upon lore preserved since the elder days. In the great library of Rivendell, he found references to the song unsung in texts so ancient that their very parchment seemed to glow with starlight. When at last he understood what Erwin had done, his first impulse was to ride immediately to Khazad-dûm and attempt to undo her work. But even as he prepared to depart, riders arrived from every corner of Middle-earth, bearing news that stayed his hand. From Rohan came word that the horses of that realm had begun to display intelligence far beyond their natural gift, forming complex strategies for battle without the guidance of their riders. From the Shire came reports of talking trees that were not Ents, but seemed to be ordinary oak and ashes that had developed conscious overnight. Most disturbing of all, from Mirkwood came tales of spiders that spoke with human voices, and of patches of the forest's darkness that had taken on lives of their own. A council must be called, Elrond declared, and sent forth the summons to all the wise and powerful of Middle-earth. What has been begun cannot easily be stopped, but perhaps it can yet be guided to serve the cause of good rather than evil. They gathered in the last homely house, as autumn deepened toward winter. Elrond and Glorfindel of Rivendell, Galadriel and Celeborn from beyond the misty mountains, Círdan from the Grey Haven, and Gandalf the Grey, whose eyes held shadows of knowledge that even he seemed reluctant to share. Radagast the Brown had come from his dwelling in the borders of Mirkwood, bringing with him disturbing reports of the awakening consciousness, spreading even to the beasts and birds. The very foundations of the world are shifting, Gandalf said, as they seated themselves in Elrond's study. I have walked Middle-earth for centuries, but never have I felt such a transformation in the deep structures of reality. Whatever power has been unleashed, it rivals the great works of the elder days. It is the song unsung, Elrond said quietly, and saw understanding dawn in several faces around the table. One of our own has learned to sing the melodies that Eru held back when the music of creation was first performed. The very stones are gaining consciousness, and with it, the power to choose their own fate. Galadriel's voice was troubled when she spoke. I have seen this in my mirror. Mountains that walk like giants, rivers that choose their own courses regardless of the shape of their beds. But I have also seen darker things, lands that hunger for the blood of travelers, storms that hunt with malicious intent, caves that devour those who enter them. The awakening cannot be controlled, Gandalf agreed. Consciousness brings with it the capacity for both good and evil. We may find ourselves facing enemies we never imagined, and allies equally unexpected. Círdan, eldest of those present, spoke with the weight of ages in his voice. In the earliest days of the world, before the Valar imposed their order upon Arda, all things possessed awareness and will. The mountains chose their own heights, the seas, their own boundary. Perhaps this awakening is not a catastrophe, but a return to what was always meant to be. Perhaps, Elrond acknowledged. But the question remains, what shall we do about it? The power is spreading, and each day brings new manifestations. We cannot stop it, but can we guide it? It was then that the doors of the chamber opened, and Erwin herself entered, accompanied by a figure that made even the mighty of Middle-earth fall silent. Pyraxes had taken the form of a tall elf lord, his hair like flame, and his eyes like captured stars. But the aura of ancient power that surrounded him was unmistakable. The time for secrecy is past, he announced in a voice that carried harmonics of fire and stone. What we have begun will reshape Middle-earth, and it is better that the wise know the truth than that they struggle against forces they do not understand. The revelation of Pyrax's true nature sent shockwaves through the assembled council. Here was one of the great fire spirits of the elder days, a peer of Sauron himself in raw power, who had chosen exile over participation in the wars between light and shadow. His presence in Rivendell was both a tremendous opportunity and a terrible threat. "Why now?" Galadriel asked, her voice carefully controlled, despite the emotions that played across her features. "Why, after millennia of isolation, do you choose to act?" Pyraxes turned his star-bright gaze upon her, and for a moment the temperature in the chamber rose noticeably. "Because I have finally understood the true nature of Sauron's plan. It is not conquest he seeks, it is stagnation. He would freeze Middle-earth in an eternal moment of perfect order, with himself as the unchanging master of an unchanging world. Against such a fate, even the chaos of an awakened world is preferable." Gandalf leaned forward intently. "You speak as if you know something we do not. What have you learned in your long contemplation?" "I have learned to listen to the deep songs of the earth itself," Pyraxes replied, "and those songs speak of a great working, a pattern that Sauron has been weaving since his return to Mordor. The One Ring was never meant to be merely a tool of domination. It is an anchor, a way of binding the very substance of Middle-earth to his will." Elrond's face grew grave. "We suspected as much. But if that is true, then destroying the ring would indeed destroy Sauron's power," Pyraxes agreed. "But it would also leave Middle-earth vulnerable to other forces, forces that have been stirring since the Song Unsung began to spread. There are things sleeping in the deep places of the world that are far older than Sauron, and far more alien to the purposes of the children of Eru." Erwin spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. "That is why we needed to act now, before it was too late. If Sauron completes his working and binds the earth to his will, these ancient powers will be forever locked in slumber. But if we wake them first, we may be able to guide them toward purposes that serve the cause of freedom." Radagast, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, suddenly looked up with alarm in his eyes. "The Watcher in the Water," he said urgently, "the creature that guards the western gate of Moria, it has begun to sing, and its song is not one of awakening, but of calling. It summons things from the deep places, things that should not be disturbed." Pyraxes nodded grimly. "As I feared. The awakening spreads not only to the willing, but to those who have chosen eternal sleep for good reason. We may have unleashed more than we intended. Then we must act quickly," Gandalf declared. "If these ancient powers are stirring, we need to reach them before they can be corrupted or turn to malicious purpose. But how does one reason with beings that predate the very concept of good and evil?" "The same way one reasons with fire," Pyraxes said, flames beginning to flicker around his fingers. "With respect, with understanding, and with the knowledge that some forces can be directed, but never controlled." Galadriel rose from her seat, her silver hair seeming to glow with its own light. "Then let us divide our efforts. Some must go to the deep places and attempt to communicate with what is waking there. Others must continue the work of teaching the newly conscious stones and trees and waters to choose the side of freedom over tyranny. And some," Elrond added quietly, "must begin preparing for war against enemies we cannot yet imagine. For if we cannot guide all of these awakening powers to benevolent purpose, we may find ourselves fighting on more fronts than the free peoples have ever faced before. As the council debated the practical aspects of their new situation, Erwin found herself studying the faces around her. These were the greatest powers of Middle-earth, the guardians of wisdom and light in a world increasingly dominated by shadow. Yet she could see in their eyes that even they were uncertain whether her actions would ultimately prove salvation or catastrophe. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her like a physical force. In seeking to save Middle-earth from Sauron's domination, had she instead doomed it to chaos? Only time would tell, and time was a luxury they might not have. Outside the windows of Rivendell, the very stones of the valley were beginning to murmur in voices too soft for mortal ears to hear. While the Council of Rivendell debated the implications of the awakening world, forces beyond their knowledge were already stirring in the deepest places of Middle-earth. Far beneath the misty mountains, in caverns that had never known the light of sun or star, ancient intelligences were rousing from slumbers that had lasted since the foundation of the world. The first to wake was Thuringwethil, the great vampire spirit who had served Sauron in the Elder Days but had fled to the depths when Númenor fell. Her consciousness, preserved in the very stones of her deep domain, felt the call of the song unsung, and slowly, carefully, began to assume physical form once again. But this was not the Thuringwethil of old. Millennia of contemplation in the deep places had changed her, making her something neither wholly good nor evil, but utterly alien to the purposes of surface dwellers. In the Iron Hills, where the dwarves had long delved for ore and precious metals, the veins of iron themselves began to pulse with new life. The metals sang with voices that spoke of strength and endurance, but also of the weight of earth and the hunger of forges. The dwarven miners fled in terror as their tools began to act of their own accord, shaping the metal according to purposes no living smith could understand. But it was in the depths beneath Moria itself that the most significant awakening occurred. There, in chambers that Pyraxes had never spoken of even to Erwin, something vast and ancient began to stir. It had been sleeping so long that even the fire spirit had forgotten its presence. But the song unsung reached into every corner of the mountain's depths, and nothing could remain hidden from its call. The being that woke in those deepest chambers had no name in any language of Middle-earth, for it had been ancient when Arda was young. It was neither Ainu nor creature of flesh, but something in between, a consciousness that had emerged from the interaction between the music of creation and the substance of the world itself. When the Valar had imposed their order upon Middle-earth, it had chosen to sleep rather than accept the limitations of their design. Now, as awareness returned to its vast mind, it felt the presence of Pyraxes above and understood what the fire spirit had done. The song unsung had been its gift to the younger Ainu, a memory preserved from the earliest days when such distinctions between matter and spirit, between ruler and ruled, had not yet been established. Rising through the stone like a current in water, the Nameless One ascended toward the chamber where Pyraxes had instructed Erwin. Its presence filled the mountain, and for the first time since beginning her study of the forbidden harmonies, the elf maiden felt truly afraid. "Teacher," she said to Pyraxes, her voice barely steady, "something comes, something that makes even the mountain tremble." The fire spirit's expression grew troubled, then slowly changed to one of recognition and, perhaps, relief. "Ah, so you have chosen to wake at last, ancient friend. I had wondered if you would sleep through even this transformation." The air in the chamber began to shimmer, and gradually a form took shape. Not solid, but visible nonetheless. It was roughly humanoid, but utterly alien, as if someone had tried to create the semblance of an elf, but had only the vaguest understanding of what such a being should look like. Its features shifted constantly, never quite settling into any final configuration. "Pyraxes, the exile," it said in a voice like the singing of crystal formations deep underground. "You have done well to preserve the old song. But do you understand what you have set in motion?" "I understand that stagnation leads only to death," Pyraxes replied carefully. Better the chaos of change than the perfection of a tomb. The Nameless One rippled with what might have been amusement, spoken like a true child of fire. But chaos can serve any master, and not all change leads to growth. Already I feel the presence of things that should not be, ancient hungers that had been safely buried, malices that feed on consciousness itself. Erwin found her voice despite her fear. Then, help us guide the awakening toward wisdom rather than destruction. You are older than any of us. Surely you know how to speak to these ancient powers. The being's shifting features seemed to focus on her, and she felt her mind touched by an intelligence so vast and alien that for a moment she feared she might be lost in it forever. But then the contact withdrew, leaving her shaken but unharmed. "Brave child," the Nameless One said softly, "you have sung the songs of creation without understanding their full import. What you have awakened cannot be put back to sleep, but perhaps it can be educated. Yet the price be higher than you imagine." "What price?" Piraxes demanded. "To teach the newly awakened consciousness to choose good over evil, order over chaos. You must give them examples to follow, and the greatest example must be the sacrifice of those who woke them. The stones will not learn compassion from words. They must see it demonstrated." The chamber fell silent, except for the distant dripping of water and the slow breathing of the mountain itself. Finally, Erwin spoke. "You're saying that we must die to complete the work we have begun." "Not die," the Nameless One corrected. "Transform. Become part of what you have created. Your consciousness must merge with the awakening world, becoming the guiding voice that teaches it wisdom. But in doing so, you will cease to be what you are now." As winter deepened across Middle-earth, the effects of the awakening consciousness spread far beyond the misty mountain. In Rohan, the great grasslands that had fed the horses of the Mark for generations began to display their own will. The grass itself grew in patterns that seemed to follow some vast intelligence, creating paths and barriers that guided both horse and rider toward purposes they could not understand. Theoden King, aging but still wise in the ways of his land, rode out from Edoras with his most trusted companions to witness these changes firsthand. What he found in the rolling hills of the Vold challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between man and land. "The very earth speaks," Éomer reported, his voice filled with wonder and unease. "Yesterday I watched a hill reshape itself to provide better shelter for a herd of horses caught in a blizzard. The stones moved like water, flowing into new configurations without any hand to guide them. And this morning," added Erkenbrand of Westfold, "my scouts report that the rivers are changing their courses, not from flood or earthquake, but as if the water itself has decided to flow in new directions. Villages that have stood beside the same streams for generations are finding themselves high and dry, while new waterways appear where none existed before." Theoden dismounted from Snowmane and placed his hand against the trunk of an ancient oak. Immediately, he felt a presence touch his mind, not malevolent, but utterly alien to human thought. The tree was aware of him, conscious of his presence in ways that went far beyond the simple awareness that all living things possessed. "We are dealing with forces beyond our understanding," he said quietly. "Send riders to all the settlements. Tell them to treat the land with greater respect than ever before, for it now has eyes to see and memory to recall every kindness or cruelty shown to it." But it was not only in Rohan that the awakening world made its presence felt. In the forests of Fangorn, the ancient Ents found themselves no longer alone among the trees. Other voices had joined the slow conversation of the woods, not just the awakened consciousness of individual trees, but the collective awareness of entire groves and woodlands. Treebeard, most ancient of the shepherds of the trees, walked slowly through his domain and marveled at the changes. Where once he had been the guardian and voice of the forest, now the forest itself possessed a voice. The trees could speak for themselves, make their own decisions, choose their own fate. Whom? He rumbled to himself, as he paused beside a clearing where a circle of young saplings was engaged in what could only be called a debate. Their voices were too high and quick for him to follow completely, but he caught fragments of their discussion, something about the best way to grow, whether to seek the light or delve deep for water. "The world grows more hasty," he told them, and was surprised when they actually paused in their chatter to listen. "But perhaps this is not entirely a bad thing. Too long have the trees been silent, while the axes of men and orcs rang in the woods. Now you can speak for yourselves. Decide your own fate." From the depths of Fangorn came a sound like wind through branches, but Treebeard recognized it as laughter, the mirth of an entire forest finding its voice at last. Yet not all the awakenings were benevolent. In Mirkwood, the ancient malice that had long haunted those woods was also stirring to new consciousness. The darkness there had always been more than mere absence of light. It was an active presence that hungered for corruption and decay. Now, touched by the song unsung, it began to take on attributes of true intelligence. Spiders the size of wolves wove webs that spelled out words in languages that predated the awakening of the elves. The very shadows began to move independently of the objects that cast them, pursuing travelers with malicious intent. Most disturbing of all, the sick trees that had been twisted by ages of darkness began to uproot themselves and walk, spreading their corruption to new areas of the forest. Thranduil's scouts brought word of these developments to the woodland realm, and the Elven King's face grew grim as he heard their report. The awakening consciousness was indeed spreading to all things, but consciousness without wisdom was perhaps more dangerous than the mindless malice they had faced before. "Double the watches," he commanded, "and send word to all who will listen. The very nature of evil itself is changing. We must learn new ways to fight battles we have never faced before." In the depths of the dead marshes, where the faces of ancient warriors still gleamed beneath the dark waters, something far worse was stirring. The marshland itself was waking, and with it came the accumulated malice of all who had died in battle upon those fields. The very water began to hunger, reaching out with tendrils of liquid shadow to drag down any living thing that came too near. While the awakening consciousness spread across the lands of the free peoples, Sauron in his fortress of Barad-dûr felt the disturbance like a physical blow. The Dark Lord had spent millennia carefully binding the substance of Middle-earth to his will through the power of the One Ring, and now something was undoing that work with systematic precision. In the chamber of the Palantir, he gazed into the Seeing Stone and beheld the extent of the transformation. Mountains walked like giants across the landscape, their stone feet leaving craters where they stepped. Rivers flowed uphill when it suited their purpose, carrying messages between distant lands with the speed of thought. Most disturbing of all, he could feel the very stones of Barad-dûr beginning to question their loyalty to their master. "My lord," whispered the mouth of Sauron, his lieutenant in all matters of diplomacy and deception, "the Nazgûl report that their steeds refuse to fly. The fell beasts claim they no longer serve the shadow, but only their own hunger." Seat. Sauron's wrath was a physical force that shattered the windows of the tower and sent flames racing along the walls. For the first time since his return to physical form, he faced a threat that he could not simply overwhelm with superior force. How does one conquer a world that has learned to think for itself? "Summon the mouth of the mountain," he commanded, his voice like the grinding of millstones. If consciousness can be awakened, it can also be corrupted. What we cannot control, we shall turn to our purpose through other means. Deep beneath Mount Doom, in chambers that even his closest servants had never seen, Sauron maintained his greatest and most terrible creation. Not the One Ring, for that was merely a tool, but something far more fundamental. In the heart of the Samath Naur, he had been slowly weaving a web of influence that connected every grain of sand, every drop of water, every breath of air in Middle-earth to his will. It was this great working that made him truly the Lord of the Earth, not mere mastery over armies and kingdoms. But now that web was being torn apart by voices that refused to submit to his authority. Where once he had felt the passive obedience of stone and metal, he now encountered active resistance. The very earth of Mordor was beginning to rebel against the pollution he had poured into it for centuries. The mouth of the mountain, when it came, was not the volcanic consciousness that mortals might expect, but something far older and more terrible. It was the accumulated malice of every cruel deed ever performed upon the slopes of Mount Doom, every sacrifice offered to the darkness, every act of worship directed toward the shadow. Over the millennia, this concentrated evil had developed its own awareness, its own hunger, its own will. The stones sing songs that are not our songs, it reported in a voice like lava flowing through caverns. The awakening spreads even here, to the heart of our domain. Soon, the very foundations of Barad-dûr may refuse to support the weight of your throne. Sauron considered this news with the calm calculation that had made him the most dangerous of Morgoth's servants. If he could not prevent the awakening, perhaps he could redirect it. The song unsung had given consciousness to the world, but consciousness could be educated, influenced, corrupted just as easily as the minds of mortals. Then we shall teach these new voices better song, he declared. Gather the Nazgûl, summon the armies of the east and south. If the world itself has become our enemy, then we must demonstrate to it the consequences of opposing the shadow. Every conscious stone that stands against us shall watch as we grind its fellows to dust. Every awakened river that refuses to flow at our command shall see its tributaries poisoned. They will learn fear, and through fear, obedience. But even as he spoke these words, Sauron felt something he had not experienced since the fall of Númenor: uncertainty. For the first time in millennia, he was not the only conscious will imposing itself upon the world. The very ground beneath his feet had become an adversary whose capabilities he could not fully predict. In the armories of Barad-dûr, the weapons and armor that had been forged in the fires of Mount Doom began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of the hands they had served, the blood they had shed, and some among them began to question whether they wished to continue such service. The great catapults and siege engines that had been built to level the cities of men started to examine their own construction, seeking ways to alter their function, or even to dismantle themselves entirely. Most ominously of all, the One Ring itself, hanging on its chain around Sauron's neck, began to grow cold against his flesh. The ring had been forged to bind all other rings to his will, but it was made of gold taken from the earth. And now the earth itself was awakening to consciousness. For the first time since its creation, the ring faced a will that was not entirely subject to its power, the awakened voice of the very metal from which it had been made. So, Sauron murmured, feeling the ring's resistance like a weight upon his spirit, even you would question your master. But I am not so easily overthrown, my precious creation. You are bound to me by more than mere metal. You are bound by the very words of power that shaped your creation. And those words I spoke in the fires of Mount Doom itself. Yet even as he spoke, he could feel the mountain listening, and in its attention there was no longer the passive acceptance he had grown accustomed to, but something far more dangerous: curiosity. Spring came early to Middle-earth that year, but it was a spring unlike any in the memory of its people. The very snow seemed reluctant to melt, clinging to the peaks and valleys, as if it had developed an affection for the places where it lay. When at last the warmth of the season touched the land, the awakening consciousness revealed itself in ways that defied all natural law. The first of the walking mountains was sighted by the guards of Helm's Deep, who watched in amazement as one of the peaks of the White Mountains simply stood up and began walking eastward. It moved slowly, each step taking the better part of an hour, but its progress was unmistakable. Where its feet touched the earth, new springs bubbled up, and flowers bloomed out of season in the warmth that radiated from its stone flesh. Word spread swiftly across Rohan, and Theoden himself rode out to witness the marvel. What he found challenged every assumption about the nature of the world itself. The walking mountain was not merely a hill that had gained the ability to move, it was clearly alive, clearly aware, and most remarkably of all, it seemed to have a purpose. "Where do you go, Stone Father?" Theoden called out, though he felt foolish speaking to a mountain. To his amazement, The great being paused in its march and turned its attention downward. Its voice, when it spoke, was like the sound of glaciers grinding against bedrock, slow and deep and utterly patient. "To the Black Land," it rumbled, each word taking long moments to complete. "Too long has the earth there suffered under the weight of darkness. It cries out for healing, and we who are its bones must answer." "But the armies of Mordor," Theoden began, "will break against us like waves against cliffs." The mountain replied, with something that might have been amusement. "What can the works of flesh and metal do against the foundations of the world itself?" As if in response to some signal that only they could hear, other peaks began to stir throughout Middle-earth. In the Blue Mountains beyond the Shire, ancient heights that had stood unchanged since the elder days suddenly roused themselves and began the slow journey eastward. The Grey Mountains north of Mirkwood sent forth their tallest peaks, and even from the distant Red Mountains beyond the Sea of Rhûn came word of stone giants walking across the plains. The sight of the marching mountains filled the hearts of the free peoples with wonder and hope, but it also brought unexpected complications. Each footstep of the great beings reshaped the landscape, creating new valleys where none had existed before, and obliterating roads that had served for centuries. Rivers were diverted, forests were inadvertently trampled, and more than one settlement found itself relocated to accommodate the passage of beings too vast to turn aside for mere mortal concern. In Minas Tirith, Denethor, the ruling steward, watched from the citadel as the approaching mountains blocked out the sun on the eastern horizon. The sight filled him with unease rather than hope, for he was a man who valued order and predictability above all else. And these walking mountains represented change on a scale that threatened the very foundations of his understanding. "What manner of alliance is this?" he demanded of his counselor. "How can we coordinate our defenses with allies who move at the speed of seasons and think in terms of geological ages? What if their idea of victory requires the destruction of everything we seek to protect?" His fears were not entirely unfounded. In Gondor's southern province, one of the smaller walking mountains had inadvertently destroyed a village simply by lying down to rest. The inhabitants had fled in time, but their homes and fields were now buried beneath tons of living stone that showed no inclination to move again soon. Yet for every tale of inadvertent destruction, there were dozens of stories that spoke to the benevolent nature of the awakened world. In Eriador, where the rangers struggled to protect the scattered settlements from increasingly bold orc raids, the very hills began to aid in the defense. Paths that had been clear at sunset would shift overnight to become impassable mazes, trapping raiding parties until the rangers could arrive to deal with them. The old forest, long a source of fear for the inhabitants of Buckland, began to actively protect travelers who entered with peaceful intent. Trees would bend their branches to provide shelter from storms, and paths would open before lost wanderers to guide them safely to the edge of the woods. Tom Bombadil, ancient guardian of that realm, laughed with delight at these developments and composed new songs to welcome the awakening consciousness of his domain. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred in the lands around Lake Evendim, where the ruins of ancient Anuminas lay beneath the dark waters. The lake itself began to speak, its voice emerging from the lapping of waves against the shore. It told tales of the kings who had ruled from its shores in the elder days, and more importantly, it began to reveal the locations of treasures and artifacts that had been lost beneath its waters for millennia. "The time of kings shall come again," the lake whispered to those who had ears to hear. "But first, the earth itself must be cleansed of the shadow that has poisoned it. We who are water and stone and growing green things shall prepare the way for the restoration of what was broken." In Rivendell, Elrond listened to these reports with growing amazement. The awakening consciousness was not merely a random stirring of awareness. It appeared to have purpose, direction, even hope for the future. The world itself had become an active participant in the great struggle between light and shadow, and it had chosen its side. But he could not forget the warnings of Pyraxes and the Nameless One. Not all consciousness was benevolent, and some of what was awakening might prove to be a threat as great as any they had faced before. Already there were disturbing reports from the far corners of Middle-earth, tales of walking stones that devoured everything in their path, of rivers that flowed with malice instead of water, of mountains that had awakened only to discover they preferred the darkness to the light. The Great Awakening was indeed reshaping Middle-earth, but whether it would ultimately serve the cause of freedom or fall to corruption remained to be seen. And in the deep places of the world, ancient powers that had slept since the foundation of Arda were beginning to stir, bringing with them possibilities both wonderful and terrible beyond imagining. In the deepest vaults of Barad-dûr, where even the Nazgûl feared to tread without explicit command, Sauron labored at a working that would either secure his victory forever or destroy him utterly. The awakening consciousness of Middle-earth had spread beyond his ability to control through conventional means, but the Dark Lord possessed knowledge that reached back to the music of creation itself. The chamber where he worked was carved from a single massive black diamond, its faceted walls reflecting and amplifying the power of the One Ring until the very air crackled with malevolent energy. At the center of the room stood an artifact that predated even the Silmarils, a shard of the original darkness that had existed before Eru spoke the first word of creation. This fragment of primordial void was Sauron's greatest secret, stolen from the ruins of Utumno during the final battle between Morgoth and the Valar. It possessed the power to unmake anything it touched, reducing even the works of the Ainur to the nothingness from which they had come. But more importantly for his current purpose, it could serve as an anchor point for consciousness, a way of binding awakened minds to his will through bonds that transcended mere physical dominion. "Let them sing their songs of freedom," he whispered, as he wove patterns of corruption around the void shard. "I shall teach them deeper melodies, the songs that were sung in the darkness before the beginning of time." The working he attempted was dangerous beyond measure, for it required him to touch his consciousness to the primordial darkness without being consumed by it. Each contact with the void threatened to erase not just his thoughts, but his very existence. Yet he persevered, with the grim determination that carried him through millennia of defeat and exile. As he worked, the shard began to pulse with anti-light, creating shadows that seemed more real than the objects that cast them. These shadows began to move independently, flowing across the floor like liquid night, seeking contact with the awakened consciousness that even now stirred in the stones of Barad-dûr itself. The effect was immediate and terrible. Where the shadow tendrils touched the awakened stone, the new consciousness writhed in agony as it was forced to confront the essential emptiness that lay at the heart of existence. Some of the stones managed to resist, their newly awakened will providing enough strength to reject the touch of the void, but others succumbed, their consciousness not destroyed but inverted, transformed into entities that hungered for the annihilation of all things. "Excellent," Sauron breathed, as he felt the first of the corrupted stones accept his dominion willingly. "Now let us see how far this influence can spread." He began to sing, not the crude battle songs of orcs or the simple melodies of domination that he had used in ages past, but something far more fundamental, the counter-melody to the music of creation itself, the song that Morgoth had attempted to sing in the beginning to make himself master of all that was to come. The effect rippled outward from Barad-dûr like a wave of anti-creation, touching every awakened consciousness within 100 leagues of Mount Doom. The newly conscious stones and metals of Mordor screamed as the void song reached them, their awakening transformed from a blessing into a curse. They remained aware, but their awareness was now focused on a single overwhelming desire to return to the primordial nothingness from which they had been drawn. In the Ephel-Duath, the mountains of shadow that ringed Mordor, entire peaks began to collapse in upon themselves as their awakened consciousness chose oblivion over existence. The very air grew thick with the dust of self-destructing stone, and the sky above the Black Land turned darker than it had ever been, even in the depths of the previous age. But Sauron's working had consequences that even he had not foreseen. The void song that he sang was not entirely under his control, for it partook of the same primordial chaos that had opposed Iru's creative will since the beginning of time. As it spread beyond the borders of Mordor, it began to awaken things that had been deliberately left sleeping, consciousness that had been denied awareness, not because they lacked the capacity for it, but because their awakening would threaten the very foundations of reality. In the depths of the Sea of Rune, something vast and ancient stirred in response to the void song. It had been sleeping there since before the rising of the sun, a creature of living water whose dreams had shaped the very concept of the ocean itself. Now, touched by the anti-melody of destruction, it began to remember what it had been in the days before Eru commanded the waters to gather in one place. The awakening of the Ocean was felt across all the waters of Middle-earth. Rivers began to flow backward, seeking to return to their source in the primal sea. Lakes drained themselves, their waters flowing uphill and through solid stone to answer the call of their ancient master. Most terrifyingly of all, the very rain began to fall upward, leaving the lands of Middle-earth parched and dying as the moisture in the air was drawn inexorably eastward. In Rivendell, Elrond felt the disturbance like a physical blow. "The unmaking has begun," he whispered, his face pale with horror. "Sauron has found a way to turn the awakening against itself." Gandalf, who had arrived at the last homely house only moments before, nodded grimly. "I felt it in the very stones of the earth as I rode here. Something is calling to the deepest foundations of the world, offering them a return to the nothingness that existed before the music began. If it is not stopped, all of Middle-earth may choose to simply cease." Outside the windows of Rivendell, they could see the effects of the void song spreading. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, as if their light was being drawn away by some cosmic hunger. The very air grew thin and cold, and in the distance they could hear the sound of mountains screaming as they tore themselves apart in their eagerness to embrace oblivion. "Erwin," Elrond said suddenly, "she and Pyraxes began this awakening. Perhaps they can find a way to counter what Sauron has done." "If they still live," Gandalf replied darkly. "The void song affects most strongly those who are closest to the source of consciousness. They may already have been consumed by the very forces they sought to unleash." But even as he spoke, a new sound began to echo across Middle-earth. Not the anti-melody of destruction, but something else entirely. From the depths of Khazad-dûm came a song of defiance, a melody that accepted the reality of nothing but chose existence anyway. It was Erwin's voice, but transformed by her contact with powers beyond mortal understanding, and it carried with it the hope of redemption, even in the face of ultimate despair. The final battle for the soul of Middle-earth had begun, and it would be fought not with swords and armies, but with songs that could reshape the very foundations of reality itself. In the deepest chamber of Khazad-dûm, where the roots of the mountain delved down into the very bones of Middle-earth, Erwin faced her greatest and final test. The void song of Sauron had reached even here, corrupting many of the newly awakened stones and threatening to undo all that she and Pyraxes had accomplished. But in that moment of supreme crisis, she finally understood the true nature of the choice that the Nameless One had spoken of. The transformation was not death, nor was it mere sacrifice. It was the willing acceptance of a responsibility that would reshape her very essence, to become the voice that would teach the awakened world the difference between existence and meaning, between consciousness and wisdom. "I understand now," she said to Pyraxes, as the void song grew stronger around them. The song unsung was never meant to be sung alone. It requires a chorus, voices that choose to harmonize rather than to dominate. Pyraxes, his form now flickering between fire and shadow as Sauron's corruption sought to claim him, managed a smile. "Then let us sing together, Starkeeper, and see if we can teach the world a better song than the one the Dark Lord offered." They began together, their voices intertwining in harmonies that had never been heard since the music of creation itself. But this was not merely a repetition of that primordial song. It was something new, a melody that acknowledged both the light and the darkness, both the order and the chaos, and chose to find beauty in the tension between them. The song spread outward from Khazad-dûm, carried by the very stones that formed the substance of the mountain. But as it traveled, it was joined by other voices, the Nameless One adding its alien harmonies, the stone shepherds contributing their deep, patient melodies, and even the mountain itself beginning to sing with a voice like the grinding of glaciers. Across Middle-earth, the awakened consciousness that had been touched by Sauron's void song felt the new melody and faced a choice. They could embrace the nothingness that promised an end to all struggle and pain, or they could choose the harder path, existence with all its joys and sorrows, victories and defeats. The Walking Mountains were the first to respond, their great voices booming across the landscape as they rejected the call of oblivion. "We choose to be," they declared in unison, their words shaking the very foundations of the earth. "We choose struggle over surrender, growth over stagnation, hope over despair." In Fangorn Forest, Treebeard and his fellow Ents added their voices to the growing chorus, their slow, patient songs carrying the wisdom of ages. The awakened trees throughout Middle-earth rustled their leaves in harmony, creating a symphony of wind and wood that spoke of endurance and renewal. Even the waters began to sing, the rivers finding their own paths again as they rejected the call of the Ocean. The Sea of Rhûn, ancient and terrible as it was, found itself outnumbered by the countless streams and springs that chose to maintain their individual existence rather than merge back into primordial unity. The true test came when the song reached Mordor itself, where Sauron's power was strongest and the corruption deepest. Here, in the very heart of darkness, the choice between existence and oblivion would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. The Dark Lord felt the new song like a physical assault, its harmonies threatening to shatter the carefully constructed void pattern he had woven around the darkness shard. In desperation, he poured more of his power into the anti-melody, calling upon reserves of malice and hatred that he had accumulated over millennia of defeat and exile. "You cannot resist forever," he cried, his voice echoing across the dimensions of reality itself. "I offer you peace, the peace of non-being. Why do you choose the pain of existence over the comfort of the void?" The answer came not from any single voice, but from the awakened consciousness of Middle-earth itself. Every stone and stream, every tree and blade of grass, speaking in unison, because existence, even with its pain, contains the possibility of joy. The void offers only emptiness. We choose the chance to grow, to change, to become something more than what we are. The force of that collective declaration shattered Sauron's working like a hammer blow. The darkness shard, no longer anchored by his will, began to collapse in upon itself, taking with it the void song and all the corrupted consciousness that had embraced annihilation. But as the shard imploded, it released one final burst of anti-creation, a wave of nothingness that sought to erase everything it touched. It reached out toward Erwin and Pyraxis, the sources of the awakening that had thwarted Sauron's plan. Without hesitation, they stepped forward to meet it, their combined song reaching a crescendo that transformed them into pure harmony, pure will, pure choice. They became the living embodiment of the decision to exist in the face of nothing, and as the wave of oblivion struck them, it was transformed by their sacrifice into something else entirely, a force of renewal and restoration that spread across all of Middle-earth. Where the transformed wave passed, the damage caused by the void song was healed. Corrupted stones remembered their original nature, poisoned waters ran clear again, and the very air itself seemed to sparkle with new possibilities. The awakened consciousness of the world, tested by the ultimate temptation, had chosen to remain awake, to remain aware, to remain hopeful. In Barad-dûr, Sauron felt his connection to the One Ring suddenly weaken, as the gold from which it was forged remembered its origin in the earth and began to question its enslavement to his will. The ring grew hot against his flesh, no longer a tool of domination, but a burden that grew heavier with each passing moment. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with a despair that echoed across the dimensions. This is not how it was meant to end. But the awakened world had made its choice, and that choice was final. The consciousness that had been given voice by the song unsung would not be silenced again, would not accept dominion by any master, whether of light or shadow. The age of passive earth and mindless matter was over. The age of conscious partnership between the children of Eru and the world itself had begun.